The dust swirled like ghosts around Daniel Hayes's wagon wheels as he pulled into the frontier town of Copper Ridge, that scorching afternoon in 1854. He had no idea that within minutes, a desperate child would change the entire course of his life with the most shocking proposal he'd ever heard. But when 9-year-old Emma Sullivan stepped boldly into the middle of Main Street and flagged down his freight wagon, she carried with her a plea so desperate, so unexpected, that it would force Daniel to choose between the solitary life he'd planned and the family he never knew he needed. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast canvas of sand, sage, and merciless sun. Daniel Hayes wiped the sweat from his brow as his freight wagon creaked along the dusty trail toward Copper Ridge. The leather reins felt slick in his calloused hands, and his throat was parched despite the careful rationing of water from his nearly empty barrel. He'd been a freight hauler for 18 long years, carrying supplies across the unforgiving territories of the American West. Medicine for remote mining camps, tools for struggling homesteaders, precious letters connecting isolated families to the world they'd left behind. It was lonely work, dangerous work, but it suited a man who'd learned not to get too attached to places or people. The wagon behind him groaned under its precious cargo: bottles of patent medicine, bolts of cloth, ammunition, and sundry goods that could mean the difference between life and death in the harsh frontier towns scattered across the territory. Every rut in the road, every jolt and bump threatened to shatter his merchandise. But Daniel had learned long ago how to navigate these treacherous paths. His 2 horses, Blaze and Storm, were veterans of countless journeys across the desert. Their coats were slick with perspiration, and their ears twitched constantly at the sounds of the wilderness around them. Daniel spoke to them often during these long, solitary trips, finding comfort in their steady presence and the rhythmic sound of their hooves against the hard-packed earth. "Easy now, boys," Daniel murmured as they approached a bend in the trail. "Copper Ridge is just ahead, fresh water and good hay waiting for you." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. In this harsh landscape, sunset was both beautiful and dangerous. It meant cooler temperatures, but it also meant the predators would soon be stirring. Coyotes, mountain lions, and worse things that prowled the darkness. As they rounded the bend, Daniel spotted something that made his blood run cold. Coiled directly in the center of the trail was a massive diamondback rattlesnake, its triangular head raised in warning, its tail buzzing with deadly promise. The serpent was easily 6 feet long, thick as a man's arm, with diamond patterns across its back that gleamed like polished scales in the fading sunlight. "Whoa there," Daniel called softly, pulling back on the reins. Blaze and Storm came to an immediate halt, their nostrils flaring as they caught the scent of danger. The horses began to dance nervously, their eyes rolling white with fear. Daniel knew better than to rush a confrontation with a rattlesnake of this size. One bite could kill a horse within minutes, and out here in the middle of nowhere, losing his animals would be a death sentence. He slowly reached for the long wooden staff he kept secured to the side of his wagon, his movements deliberate and calm. The snake's head swayed hypnotically as it tasted the air with its forked tongue. Its beady black eyes seemed to stare directly into Daniel's soul, as if challenging him to make the first move. The buzzing of its rattle grew louder, a sound like bacon sizzling in a hot pan, but infinitely more menacing. "We don't want any trouble here, friend," Daniel said quietly, as much to calm his own nerves as to address the serpent. "Just need to pass on through?" For what felt like an eternity, man and snake regarded each other across the dusty trail. The desert held its breath, waiting to see who would blink first. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the rattlesnake uncoiled itself and slithered off into the brush, disappearing into the sage and prickly pear as if it had never been there at all. Daniel released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "Sometimes the desert shows mercy after all." He clicked his tongue, and Blaze and Storm resumed their steady pace, though they remained skittish for the next quarter mile. As they crested a small rise, the town of Copper Ridge came into view below them, and Daniel felt his spirits lift despite the encounter with the snake. The settlement wasn't much to look at, maybe 40 buildings scattered along both sides of a main street. most constructed from adobe brick that blended seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. A few wooden structures stood out starkly against the desert backdrop, their boards already weathered gray by the relentless sun and wind. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Daniel could see people moving about their daily business. Children played in the dusty street, while women hung laundry on lines strung between buildings. Men in work clothes congregated outside what appeared to be a saloon, their voices carrying on the still air. It looked peaceful enough, but Daniel had learned not to trust appearances in frontier towns. Every settlement had its secrets, its tensions, its unspoken rules that an outsider might violate without warning. He'd seen too many places where desperation had driven good people to do terrible things, where lawlessness masqueraded as justice. As his wagon rolled down the main street of Copper Ridge, Daniel noticed heads turning to watch his progress. A frontier town always took note of strangers, especially those carrying valuable cargo. Some faces seemed friendly enough, offering nods of greeting or curious smiles. Others watched with the calculating expressions of people who measured every newcomer as either an opportunity or a threat. Children ran alongside his wagon for a few yards before their mothers called them back. Dogs barked from porches and doorways. The whole scene had the feeling of a community going about its normal routines, but Daniel's instincts told him to stay alert. He'd survived 18 years in this business by trusting those instincts. The general store sat at the intersection of Main Street and what appeared to be the only cross street worthy of the name. It was a substantial building with a covered porch and large windows, displaying an assortment of goods. This was where Daniel would conduct most of his business, selling his wares to the store owner, who would then distribute them to the local population. But as he guided his horses toward the hitching post in front of the store, something made him pause. A feeling, perhaps, or some subtle wrongness in the air that he couldn't quite identify. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, the same instinctive warning that had saved his life more times than he cared to count. That's when he heard it, a voice cutting across the afternoon air like a knife through silk. "You there! Stop!" Daniel turned in his wagon seat to see a small figure darting between the shadows of a ramshackle cabin, moving with the desperate urgency of someone chasing their last hope. A little girl burst into the sunlight, her copper-colored hair streaming behind her like a banner as she ran toward his wagon with bare feet flying across the hard-packed dirt. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old, but there was something in her eyes, a determination that belonged on the face of someone much older, someone who had seen too much hardship too young. Her dress had once been blue, but it was now faded to the color of old bruises, carefully patched and mended, with loving hands that spoke of poverty but not neglect. "Please, mister, don't leave," she called out, her small chest heaving as she reached his wagon. "I need to ask you something important." Daniel pulled his horses to a complete stop, dust swirling around the wheels as the wagon settled. He climbed down from his seat, hat in hand, struck by the fierce intelligence in the child's blue eyes. There was desperation there, yes, but also a kind of courage that took his breath away. "What's the matter, little miss?" Daniel asked gently, crouching down so they could speak at eye level. "You look like you've got something mighty important on your mind." Behind the girl, Daniel could see movement in the doorway of the dilapidated cabin. A woman appeared, young, probably not much past 25, with the same copper hair as the child, but pulled back in a practical bun. Even from a distance, he could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way she leaned against the doorframe as if standing required more energy than she possessed. "Emma," the woman called out, her voice carrying a mixture of embarrassment and alarm. "Come back here this instant. You can't just accost strangers in the street." But Emma, for that was clearly the child's name, planted her small feet firmly in the dirt and ignored her mother's command. She looked up at Daniel with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. "My name is Emma Sullivan," she announced with the formal dignity of someone conducting important business, "and I need to ask you the most important question of my whole life." Daniel found himself intrigued despite the unusual circumstances. "Well then, Miss Emma Sullivan, I'm Daniel Hayes, and I'm listening." Emma took a deep breath, as if gathering all her courage for what came next. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to ask. "Would you consider marrying my mama?" The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. His hat slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, landing in the dust at his feet with a soft thump. Around them, the desert seemed to hold its breath, even the constant wind falling silent, as if the very air was shocked by the child's audacious proposal. "Emma!" The woman's voice cracked like a whip as she hurried toward them, her face burning with mortification. "I am so sorry, sir. My daughter doesn't understand. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Emma whirled around to face her mother, her small jaws set with stubborn determination. "I do understand, Mama. You're getting sicker every day, and we don't have any money left. And Mr. Hartwell says we have to pay him by Sunday, or we lose our house. If you had a husband, maybe he'd leave us alone." Daniel looked back and forth between mother and daughter, his mind reeling from the unexpected turn this ordinary afternoon had taken. The woman, Grace Sullivan, he assumed, had reached them now, and up close he could see the fever flush in her cheeks, the way her hands trembled with exhaustion or illness. "Mrs. Sullivan," Daniel said carefully, bending to retrieve his hat from the dust. "I take it your daughter has a talent for direct communication?" Grace's face was the color of a desert sunset. "Mr. Hayes, I cannot begin to apologize for my daughter's behavior. She's been under a great deal of stress lately, and I'm afraid it's affected her judgment." But Emma stepped between them, looking up at Daniel with eyes that held no trace of childish whimsy. "I've been watching the men who come through town," she said with the seriousness of someone conducting a business negotiation. "Most of them drink too much, or they're mean to animals, or they look at Mama in ways that make her uncomfortable." Daniel raised his eyebrows. This little girl was remarkably observant for her age. "But you're different," Emma continued. "When your horses got spooked by that snake back there, you didn't hit them or curse at them. You just waited patiently until they calmed down. And you stopped when I called out to you, even though you don't know me. That tells me you're a good man." Grace Sullivan looked as if she wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole. "Emma, you cannot simply ask strangers to marry your mother. It's completely inappropriate." "Why not?" Emma asked with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Papa always said that when you need help, you should ask for it directly. Being shy doesn't solve problems." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Daniel looked up to see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. A storm was coming, and from the look of those clouds, it was going to be a big one. The desert could be deceptive that way. Bone dry one moment, flooded the next. "This Hartwell fellow you mentioned," Daniel said carefully, addressing Emma while keeping one eye on her mother's increasingly pale face. "He's the one you owe money to?" Emma nodded vigorously before her mother could stop her. $78 plus interest. He says if we can't pay by Sunday, we'll have to find another way to settle the debt. But I don't think he means working in his store." The implication in those words made Daniel's blood run cold. He'd encountered men like this Hartwell character in other frontier towns, predators who used debt and desperation to take advantage of vulnerable people. The thought of this woman and child facing such a situation made his hands clench involuntarily into fists. Grace Sullivan swayed slightly on her feet, and Daniel instinctively reached out to steady her. Her skin was burning with fever, and up close he could see the telltale signs of serious illness. The hollow cheeks, the bright spots of color on pale skin, the way she had to concentrate just to remain standing. "Ma'am," Daniel said gently, "when's the last time you saw a doctor?" Grace pulled away from his touch, wrapping her arms around herself defensively. "We can't afford a doctor, Mr. Hayes. We can barely afford food." The first fat raindrops began to fall, kicking up tiny clouds of dust where they struck the parched earth. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon was finally arriving, and from the look of those black clouds rolling in from the west, it was going to be a real gully washer. "We need to get inside, Warner," Daniel said, looking up at the darkening sky. "This is going to be a bad one." Emma grabbed her mother's hand and looked up at Daniel with hopeful eyes. "You could wait out the storm with us, if you want. Our cabin isn't much, but it's dry." Grace started to protest, but Daniel was already unhitching his horses from the wagon. "I'd be grateful for the shelter, ma'am. And maybe while we wait for this storm to pass, you can tell me more about your situation." As the three of them hurried toward the ramshackle cabin, Daniel felt as if he was walking toward something that would change his life forever. He'd planned to spend the night in Copper Ridge, sell his goods in the morning, and continue on toward California, where he hoped to start fresh in a new territory. But as he followed Emma and her sick mother into their modest home, Daniel realized that sometimes the most important journeys began not with a destination in mind, but with a simple decision to help a stranger in need. Inside the Sullivan cabin, Daniel stopped and stared in amazement. He had expected to find the kind of squalid conditions that often accompany desperate poverty, but what greeted him instead was something entirely different. Every surface gleamed with careful cleaning, despite the obvious wear and age of the furnishings. Dried wildflowers hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with a faint, sweet fragrance. A colorful quilt covered the single bed, each patch sewn with tiny, precise stitches that spoke of countless hours of patient work. "This is beautiful," Daniel said, and he meant every word. Grace's face softened with surprise and pleasure. "Thank you. I try to make it feel like a real home, even though—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Even though what, Mama?" Emma asked, climbing onto one of the wooden chairs that had been carefully positioned around a small table. "Even though we might not be able to stay much longer," Grace admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel removed his hat and set it on the table, noting how even this simple gesture seemed to make Grace nervous. She was clearly unaccustomed to having strange men in her home, and he made a mental note to do everything possible to put her at ease. Outside, the storm was intensifying rapidly. Rain drummed against the roof with increasing force, and lightning illuminated the small windows in brilliant, momentary flashes. Thunder rolled across the desert like artillery fire, shaking the very foundations of the modest structure. "Tell me about this debt," Daniel said gently, settling into the chair across from Grace, while Emma perched between them like a small, determined guardian angel. Grace's hands trembled as she poured water from a clay pitcher into 3 tin cups. "I shouldn't burden a stranger with our troubles, Mr. Hayes. You have your own concerns, your own destination to reach." "But you're not a stranger anymore," Emma announced with the absolute certainty of childhood. "You're sitting at our table, drinking our water, and staying out of the rain in our house. That makes you practically family." Daniel couldn't help but smile at the girl's logic. "Well then, as practically family, I'd like to know what's troubling you both." Grace sat down slowly, as if the simple act of lowering herself into the chair required considerable effort. Her green eyes were bright with fever, but also with unshed tears. "It started last winter when my husband Thomas got sick." "Papa worked in the silver mine," Emma added, her voice growing small and sad. "He said the dust was getting in his lungs and making it hard to breathe, but we needed the money." Daniel nodded grimly. He'd seen mining towns before, had witnessed firsthand how the promise of precious metals could lure men into dangerous, unhealthy work. The mine owners got rich while the workers slowly poisoned themselves in the dark tunnels beneath the earth. "Thomas started coughing," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger as she fell into the rhythm of the familiar, painful story. "At first we thought it was just a cold, something that would pass with rest and care. But it got worse, much worse. Soon he was coughing up blood, and he could barely stand long enough to get dressed in the morning." Emma's small hand found her mother's larger one, and Grace squeezed it gently before continuing. "Mr. Hartwell owns most of the businesses in Copper Ridge, including the general store and the bank. When Thomas couldn't work anymore, when we needed money for medicine and food, Mr. Hartwell offered us a loan. $78, which seemed like a fortune at the time." "It was a fortune," Emma said quietly. "Papa said it was enough to buy medicine from back east, the kind that might actually help instead of the patent medicines that don't work." Daniel felt a familiar anger building in his chest. Patent medicines were a scourge across the frontier, bottles of colored water and alcohol sold to desperate people by unscrupulous merchants who preyed on hope and ignorance. "Did the medicine help?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Grace's face crumpled slightly. "For a little while we thought it might. Thomas seemed to have more energy, was coughing less, but then winter set in properly, and the mine had an accident." "The roof fell in," Emma whispered, her eyes wide with remembered terror. Papa and 6 other men were trapped underneath all those rocks and timbers. The cabin fell silent except for the relentless drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Daniel could see the pain in both their faces, raw and immediate despite the months that had passed. They got 5 men out alive, Grace continued, her voice barely audible. Thomas was one of them, but he was hurt badly, internal injuries that the doctor said might heal with time and care. But 3 days later, he developed a fever and she couldn't finish the sentence. He died holding my hand, Emma said with the matter-of-fact tone that children sometimes use when discussing the incomprehensible. He made me promise to take care of Mama, and he made Mama promise to be strong and never give up. Daniel felt something twist painfully in his chest. This little girl had not only lost her father, but had been charged with responsibilities far beyond her years. It explained the adult wisdom in her young eyes, the fierce protectiveness she showed toward her mother. "I'm truly sorry for your loss," Daniel said, meaning every word. "Your husband sounds like he was a good man who loved his family deeply." "He was the best man I ever knew," Grace replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He used to sing Emma to sleep every night, even when he was so tired he could barely stand. He said music made everything better, even the hardest days." Daniel looked around the cabin again, noticing details he'd missed before. A man's heavy work coat still hung on a wooden peg by the door. A pair of large boots sat neatly in the corner, too big for either woman, but clearly maintained with loving care. This family was still living with the ghost of the man they'd lost, keeping his memory alive in 100 small ways. "So now Hartwell wants the full amount of the loan repaid immediately?" Daniel asked. Grace nodded miserably. "He says I've had enough time to find work, to make arrangements. But there aren't many opportunities for women in a town like this, especially women with young children to care for. I take in washing when I can, do mending and sewing, but it only brings in a few dollars a week, not nearly enough to make a dent in what we owe." "That's why I asked you to marry Mama," Emma said, looking directly at Daniel with those unnervingly mature eyes. "I've been watching all the men who come through town, trying to find one who might be good enough for her." Grace's face turned red with embarrassment. "Emma, you cannot simply evaluate potential husbands like horses at auction." "Why not?" Emma asked with genuine curiosity. "Papa always said the most important decisions deserve the most careful thought. Marriage is important, so I wanted to be sure I picked someone good." Daniel found himself both amused and impressed by the girl's logic. "And what were your criteria for this selection process?" Emma brightened, clearly pleased to be asked for her reasoning. "Well, first he had to be kind to animals. Mean people are usually mean to everything smaller than them. Second, he couldn't drink too much or smell bad or curse all the time. Third, he had to stop when I called out, which meant he had good manners and wasn't in too much of a hurry to help someone." "Emma has very high standards," Grace said dryly, though Daniel could see affection and pride warring with embarrassment in her expression. "And fourth," Emma continued, warming to her subject, "he had to have kind eyes. Mama always says you can tell a lot about a person by looking at their eyes, and yours are kind." Lightning flashed outside the window, illuminating the cabin in stark white light for a moment, before plunging it back into the warm glow of the oil lamp. Thunder followed almost immediately, indicating that the storm was directly overhead now. "This Hartwell," Daniel said carefully, "what exactly does he want if you can't pay the debt?" Grace's face went pale, and she glanced meaningfully at Emma before answering. "He's made it clear that there are alternative arrangements. That might be acceptable." Daniel felt his jaw clench with anger. He'd encountered men like Hartwell before, predators who used debt and desperation to take advantage of vulnerable women. The implications of alternative arrangements were clear enough, and the thought of this woman and child being forced into such a situation made his blood boil. "How much time do you have?" Daniel asked. "Until Sunday," Emma answered before her mother could stop her. 4 more days." 4 days. Daniel felt the weight of that deadline settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. In 4 days, this family would face a choice between homelessness and something far worse. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the desert, but inside the small cabin, Daniel found himself thinking about choices and chances, about the roads that led people to desperate situations and the small decisions that could change everything. He thought about his own plans: California, a new start, the life he'd been carefully building toward for the past several years. He thought about his wagon full of valuable goods, the money he'd saved, the dreams he'd nurtured during long, lonely nights on the trail. And then he looked at Emma's hopeful face and Grace's quiet desperation. And Daniel realized that sometimes the most important destination wasn't the one you'd planned to reach. "Tell me more about this town," Daniel said. "About the people here, about Hartwell's influence. If I'm going to understand your situation properly, I need to know what we're dealing with." Emma's face lit up with hope at that single word. "We?" Grace looked startled, as if she couldn't quite believe that a stranger might be willing to involve himself in their troubles. "Mr. Hayes," Grace said quietly, "you don't understand what you'd be getting into. Cyrus Hartwell isn't just a businessman. He's the most powerful man in Copper Ridge, and he doesn't take kindly to interference in what he considers his affairs." "Then maybe it's time someone reminded Mr. Hartwell that people aren't property," Daniel replied quietly, "and that some things are more important than money." As the storm raged outside and the little family huddled together in their modest home, Daniel Hayes found himself making a decision that would change not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in Copper Ridge. Because sometimes, he reflected, the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all. Morning came with deceptive gentleness, the storm having blown itself out during the night and left the desert air clean and cool. Daniel woke from his makeshift bed on the cabin floor to the sounds of quiet domestic activity. Grace moving carefully around the small kitchen area, trying not to wake her guests, and Emma whispering to herself as she got dressed in the corner. "Good morning," Daniel said softly, sitting up and folding the blanket Grace had provided for him. Grace turned from the stove where she was preparing what appeared to be their meager breakfast. "I hope you slept well, Mr. Hayes. I'm afraid our accommodations aren't very comfortable for a man of your size." "I've slept in far worse places," Daniel assured her, stretching the kinks out of his back. "And the company more than made up for any discomfort." Emma bounded over to him with the irrepressible energy of childhood. "Mr. Hayes, are you really going to help us with Mr. Hartwell?" "Emma," Grace warned gently, "Mr. Hayes has his own business to attend to. We can't expect him to solve our problems." But Daniel was already reaching for his boots. "Actually, I think the first thing we need to do is meet this Mr. Hartwell face to face. I'd like to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Grace's face paled. "Oh no, Mr. Hayes. You don't want to antagonize Cyrus Hartwell. He's not the kind of man who tolerates interference in his business affairs." "All the more reason to meet him on my terms rather than wait for him to come looking for us," Daniel replied, standing and buckling on his gun belt. The weight of the Colt at his hip was familiar and comforting. He'd learned long ago that in the frontier territories, being prepared for trouble was often the best way to avoid it. Emma watched him with wide eyes. "Are you going to shoot Mr. Hartwell?" "I certainly hope not," Daniel said seriously. "Violence should always be the last resort, not the first. But it's important that Mr. Hartwell understands that you and your mother have friends now, people who care about what happens to you." After a breakfast of corn cakes and weak coffee, the best Grace could manage with their limited supplies, Daniel prepared to venture into town. He'd spent the night thinking about the situation, and he'd come to several conclusions. First, Cyrus Hartwell was clearly a man who used fear and intimidation to control people. Second, Grace and Emma were completely isolated, with no family or allies to help them resist his pressure. And third, $78 might be a fortune to them, but it represented exactly the amount Daniel had been planning to spend on supplies and a fresh start in California. The town of Copper Ridge looked different in the morning light. The storm had washed the dust from the buildings and settled the dirt in the streets, giving everything a cleaner, more prosperous appearance. People were beginning to emerge from their homes and businesses, going about the daily routines that kept a frontier community functioning. Daniel made his way toward the general store, which Emma had identified as Hartwell's primary place of business. Along the way, he noticed how people reacted to his presence. Some nodded in friendly greeting, but others seemed to shrink away from him, as if association with a stranger might somehow mark them as troublemakers. The general store was a substantial building with a false front that made it appear larger than it actually was. Large windows displayed an assortment of goods designed to catch the eye of potential customers, and a covered porch provided shade for those who wanted to linger and chat about the day's business. As Daniel approached the front steps, the door opened and a man emerged who could only be Cyrus Hartwell. He was tall and broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a black suit that must have cost more than most people in Copper Ridge made in a year. His hair was perfectly groomed, his mustache waxed to sharp points, and his boots polished to a mirror shine. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of warmth or compassion. They were the eyes of a man who saw other human beings as assets to be acquired or obstacles to be removed. "You must be the freight hauler who rode in yesterday," Hartwell said, his voice smooth as silk and just as dangerous. "Word travels fast in a small town. Cyrus Hartwell at your service." He extended a well-manicured hand, and Daniel shook it briefly, noting the softness of skin that had never known hard labor. "Daniel Hayes," he replied evenly. "I understand you're the man to see about business in this town." Hartwell's smile was like winter sunshine, bright but providing no warmth. "Indeed I am. I have interests in most of the commercial enterprises in Copper Ridge. Banking, retail, real estate, mining investments. If there's money to be made, I generally have a hand in it." "Including money lending?" Daniel asked. Hartwell's eyes sharpened slightly, like a hawk spotting potential prey. "Among other services, yes. I've found that the people of Copper Ridge often need financial assistance to weather difficult times. I'm always willing to help, for a reasonable return on my investment." "How reasonable?" "That depends on the risk involved," Hartwell replied smoothly. "Some borrowers are more reliable than others. Some have collateral that secures the loan. Others," he shrugged eloquently, leaving the sentence unfinished. Daniel felt his dislike for the man growing stronger by the minute. "I'm told you have some business with the Sullivan family." Hartwell's expression didn't change, but something cold and predatory flickered in his eyes. "Ah, yes, the lovely Mrs. Sullivan and her charming daughter. A tragic situation, really. The woman finds herself in difficult circumstances through no fault of her own, except perhaps the poor judgment of marrying a man who couldn't provide adequate security for his family's future." The casual cruelty of the remark made Daniel's hands clench involuntarily, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What kind of security are you referring to?" "Financial security, of course. Life insurance, savings, property that could be leveraged in times of need. Poor Thomas Sullivan had none of those things. When he died, he left his family with nothing but debt and dependency. And you were kind enough to help them out," Daniel said dryly. "I was indeed." $78 is a substantial sum, Mr. Hayes. More than most working men see in 6 months. I provided those funds without requiring any collateral beyond Mrs. Sullivan's word that she would repay the debt. Perhaps that was overly generous of me. "And now you want the money back?" Hartwell's smile became even colder. "I'm a businessman, Mr. Hayes, not a charity. The terms of the loan were quite clear. Repayment within 1 year, with reasonable interest to compensate me for the risk I undertook. That year is nearly up, and Mrs. Sullivan has made virtually no progress towards satisfying her obligation. What happens if she can't pay? Then we'll need to explore alternative arrangements. Mrs. Sullivan is an attractive woman with certain skills that might prove valuable in the right circumstances, and the child, of course, would be well cared for. I'm not without compassion." The euphemisms were polite, but the meaning was clear enough. Daniel felt a red haze of anger threatening to cloud his vision, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper now would only make things worse for Grace and Emma. "What if someone else were to pay the debt?" Daniel asked carefully. Hartwell's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Are you offering to involve yourself in Mrs. Sullivan's financial obligations, Mr. Hayes? How gallant. But I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than a simple exchange of currency." "How so?" "You see, I've become quite fond of Mrs. Sullivan and her daughter. They've become part of the community under my protection, so to speak. It would be irresponsible of me to simply abandon them to the uncertain care of a stranger, don't you think?" The threat was delivered with perfect politeness, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Hartwell wasn't just interested in the money. He wanted Grace Sullivan for himself, and he wasn't going to let anyone interfere with his plans. "I think," Daniel said quietly, "that Mrs. Sullivan is perfectly capable of making her own decisions about who she trusts and who she doesn't." Hartwell's mask of civility slipped slightly, revealing a glimpse of the cold calculation beneath. "Mrs. Sullivan is a woman alone with a child to protect. Such women often make poor decisions when they're frightened or desperate. It's fortunate that she has concerned friends to guide her choices." "Friends like you?" "Exactly like me." Hartwell stepped closer, and Daniel could smell expensive cologne and something else, something that reminded him of decay and corruption. "A word of advice, Mr. Hayes. Copper Ridge is a small community with its own ways of doing things. Outsiders who try to disrupt established relationships often find their stay unpleasant." Daniel held the man's gaze steadily. "And I suppose you're the one who determines what those established relationships should be?" "I'm a pillar of this community, Mr. Hayes. I provide employment, financial services, and stability in an otherwise chaotic frontier environment. People depend on me, and I take that responsibility seriously." "Including your responsibility to Mrs. Sullivan?" Hartwell's smile turned predatory. "Especially my responsibility to Mrs. Sullivan. She's a vulnerable woman in need of guidance and protection. Left to her own devices, she might make choices that would be detrimental to both herself and her daughter. Such as trusting the wrong people, accepting help from strangers whose motives might not be entirely pure. Surely you can understand my concern?" Daniel understood perfectly. Hartwell was warning him to stay away from Grace and Emma, using the threat of unspecified consequences to drive him out of town before he could interfere with whatever plans the man had for the Sullivan family. "I appreciate your concern for their welfare," Daniel said carefully, "but it seems to me that Mrs. Sullivan is intelligent enough to make her own decisions about who she trusts." "Intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing, Mr. Hayes. Mrs. Sullivan may be educated, more educated than is strictly necessary for a woman in her position, but she lacks the experience to navigate the complexities of frontier life without male guidance." The casual condescension in Hartwell's voice made Daniel's teeth clench, but he forced himself to remain calm. "And you've appointed yourself to provide that guidance? Someone must. The alternative is to watch a good woman and an innocent child suffer needlessly. I'm sure you can appreciate the Christian duty involved." It was masterfully done, Daniel had to admit. Hartwell had managed to present his predatory intentions as noble concern, his desire to possess Grace Sullivan as selfless protection. No doubt he'd convinced himself that he was actually helping her by backing her into a corner where she had no choice but to accept his generosity. "Well," Daniel said finally, "I'm sure Mrs. Sullivan appreciates having such a devoted friend looking out for her interests." "I'm sure she does," Hartwell agreed, though his eyes remained cold and watchful. "And I trust that any other friends she might make will understand the delicate nature of her situation and act accordingly." "Of course," Daniel replied smoothly. "After all, true friends want what's best for the people they care about, don't they?" "Indeed they do." Hartwell stepped back slightly, his message delivered. "Well, Mr. Hayes, it's been a pleasure meeting you. I hope your business in Copper Ridge concludes satisfactorily. When do you expect to be moving on?" The question was posed casually, but Daniel heard the underlying demand for information. Hartwell wanted to know how long this potential threat would be lingering in his territory. "That depends on how quickly I can conduct my business," Daniel said noncommittally. "I've got goods to sell and supplies to purchase. Could take a few days. Could take longer." "Of course. Well, if you need anything during your stay, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm always happy to help visitors to our community." As Hartwell turned to go back into his store, Daniel caught sight of two men lounging on the porch of the saloon across the street. They were watching the conversation with obvious interest, and from their appearance, well-armed, hard-faced, and unemployed in the middle of a working day. Daniel guessed they were part of Hartwell's enforcement apparatus. He tipped his hat politely to the store owner and walked away, but he could feel eyes following him all the way back to Grace's cabin. Word of his conversation with Hartwell would spread quickly through the town's network of informants and sympathizers. By evening, everyone in Copper Ridge would know that the stranger had dared to question their unofficial king. When Daniel reached the Sullivan cabin, he found Grace hanging laundry on a line strung between two posts behind the house. Her movements were slow and careful, betraying the weakness that fever and worry had brought to her body. Emma sat on the back step, apparently mending a tear in one of her few dresses, with the careful attention of someone who couldn't afford to waste anything. "How did it go?" Grace asked anxiously, abandoning her washing to hurry toward him. "What did Mr. Hartwell say?" Daniel looked down at Emma's upturned face, noting the hope and fear warring in her young eyes. He'd spent the walk back from town thinking about what he'd learned and what it meant for this small family's future. "He's exactly what I expected," Daniel said carefully. "A man who's used to getting his own way and doesn't much like being questioned about his methods." "Did he seem willing to negotiate about the debt?" Grace asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "He made it clear that he considers you and Emma to be under his protection," Daniel replied, "and that he doesn't appreciate outside interference in what he sees as his affairs." Emma's face fell. "So he won't let us pay him back and be free?" Daniel knelt down so he could look directly into the little girl's eyes. "Emma, sometimes there are people in this world who don't play by the same rules as decent folks. They use their power to hurt others and take things that don't belong to them. Mr. Hartwell is one of those people." "But that's not fair," Emma protested. "No, it's not fair," Daniel agreed. "But that doesn't mean we have to accept it. Sometimes when you're dealing with bullies, you have to find a different way to solve the problem." Grace sat down heavily on the step beside her daughter, her face pale with exhaustion and despair. "Mr. Hayes, I appreciate everything you've tried to do, but perhaps it would be better if you just continued on your way. I don't want you to get hurt because of our troubles. And I don't want you and Emma to face this alone," Daniel replied firmly. "I've been thinking about your situation, and I believe there might be a solution." Both females looked at him with identical expressions of cautious hope. $78, Daniel said slowly, "is exactly the amount I was planning to spend on establishing myself in California." "I've got that money and more in my wagon right now," Grace gasped. "Mr. Hayes, you can't possibly be suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Daniel interrupted gently. "I'm just thinking out loud. But it seems to me that if the debt were paid in full, Hartwell would have no legal claim on either of you." "But then what?" Grace asked. "He'd still be angry about losing his investment. He'd find other ways to make our lives difficult." "Not if you had protection," Daniel said. "Not if you had someone who could stand up to him on equal terms." Emma's eyes widened as she began to understand what he was driving at. "You mean if Mama had a husband? A real husband who could protect us?" Daniel looked at Grace, seeing the conflict in her green eyes. Hope and fear, desperation and pride, all warring with each other as she tried to process what he was offering. "It wouldn't have to be a real marriage," Daniel said quietly. "Not unless you wanted it to be. It could be a business arrangement, a partnership designed to protect you and Emma from men like Hartwell. I'd pay off the debt, we'd go through a marriage ceremony, and you'd have the legal protection of being a married woman." "And what would you get out of such an arrangement?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel thought about that question seriously. What would he get? The chance to help people who desperately needed it. The opportunity to build something meaningful instead of just drifting from place to place. The possibility of having a family, even if it started as a fiction. "I'd get the chance to do something worthwhile with my life," he said finally. "I've been traveling alone for 18 years, Grace. I've seen a lot of country and met a lot of people, but I've never really belonged anywhere. Maybe it's time I stopped running and started building something that mattered." Grace stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for signs of deception or hidden motives. "You barely know us, Mr. Hayes. How can you be sure we're worth such a sacrifice?" "Because," Daniel said simply, "Emma had the courage to ask a stranger for help when her family needed it. Because you've managed to maintain your dignity and your principles even when faced with an impossible situation. Because I've seen enough of the world to recognize good people when I meet them." Emma bounced excitedly on the step. "Does this mean you'll really marry Mama? Does this mean we can stay in our house?" "Emma," Grace warned, but her voice lacked its usual sharpness. Mr. Hayes is just thinking out loud. He hasn't made any promises. Actually, Daniel said, standing and dusting off his knees, I think I have made a promise. I promised Emma yesterday that I'd help, and I intend to keep that promise. He looked directly at Grace, noting the way her hands trembled slightly as she processed what he was offering. The question is, are you willing to let me help? Are you willing to trust a stranger with your future and Emma's? Grace was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on her daughter's hopeful face. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, despite the tears threatening to fall. Mr. Hayes, Daniel, I want you to understand something. I love my first husband very deeply. I'm not ready to love someone else, and I may never be. If we did this thing, it would be a marriage of convenience, not a love match. I understand, Daniel replied, and I want you to know that I wouldn't expect anything from you that you weren't ready to give. We'd be partners, allies, friends if possible, but the choice of anything more would always be yours to make. Emma clapped her hands together in delight. So we're going to be a family? A real family? Grace and Daniel looked at each other across the dusty yard, two damaged people considering whether they could build something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate lives. Yes, Grace said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, I think we are. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect weather that made the desert seem almost welcoming. Daniel woke early, his mind already racing with the plans that needed to be made and the obstacles that would have to be overcome. Today was Thursday, which meant they had exactly 3 days before Hartwell's deadline arrived. Grace was already awake, moving quietly around the small kitchen as she prepared breakfast. She looked better than she had since Daniel had met her. The fever seemed to have broken during the night, and there was a new energy in her movements that spoke of hope rather than mere endurance. Feeling better? Daniel asked softly, not wanting to wake Emma, who was still curled up in her corner of the cabin. Much better, Grace replied, her voice stronger than it had been in days. I think it was knowing that we might actually have a way out of this mess. Hope is powerful medicine. Daniel smiled. My grandmother used to say that hope was the one thing they could never take away from you, no matter how bad things got. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She's also the one who taught me that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to change the rules of the game entirely. Grace raised an eyebrow. Is that what we're doing? Changing the rules? In a way, yes. Hartwell has been operating under the assumption that you're a helpless widow with no allies and no options. By tomorrow, he's going to discover that both of those assumptions are wrong. Emma stirred in her bed, sitting up with the tousled hair and bleary eyes of someone who'd slept deeply and peacefully for the first time in weeks. Are we really getting married today? She asked hopefully. Not today, Daniel said gently. There are arrangements to be made first, legal papers to file, a preacher to speak with, preparations to make, but soon. How soon? Emma pressed. Daniel looked at Grace, who nodded slightly. Tomorrow, he said. We'll be married tomorrow before Hartwell's deadline. Emma's face lit up like the sun coming out from behind clouds. Can I be the maid of honor? And the flower girl? And the witness? You can be whatever you want to be, Grace said, laughing despite the seriousness of their situation. It's going to be your wedding too, in a way. After breakfast, Daniel excused himself to make the rounds of Copper Ridge's various officials and business establishments. First stop was the office of Judge Marcus Wellington, who served as the territory's Justice of the Peace in addition to his other legal duties. Wellington was a thin, scholarly man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of careful demeanor that suggested he'd learned to navigate the complexities of frontier politics through caution rather than courage. His office was cramped but well organized, filled with law books and legal documents that spoke of his attempts to bring civilization to the wilderness. Mr. Hayes, Wellington said, rising from behind his desk to shake hands. What can I do for you? I'd like to file papers for a marriage license, Daniel said without preamble. The ceremony is to take place tomorrow. Wellington's eyebrows rose slightly. That's rather sudden, isn't it? Might I ask who the fortunate bride is to be? Mrs. Grace Sullivan. The judge's expression became carefully neutral. I see. And are you aware of Mrs. Sullivan's financial obligations to certain members of our community? I'm aware that she owes money to Cyrus Hartwell, Daniel replied evenly. I'm also aware that her personal debts have no bearing on her right to marry whomever she chooses. Wellington steepled his fingers and regarded Daniel thoughtfully. Mr. Hayes, I've been the territorial judge here for 8 years. In that time, I've learned that the law, while important, is only one factor in maintaining peace and stability in a frontier community. Sometimes the greater good requires flexibility in how we interpret legal requirements. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Are you saying you won't issue the license? I'm saying that Mr. Hartwell is a prominent citizen with considerable influence in this territory. He's made substantial investments in Mrs. Sullivan's welfare, and it would be unfortunate if those investments were to be lost due to hasty decisions made without proper consultation. Consultation with whom? With the parties who have a legitimate interest in Mrs. Sullivan's future, of course. Daniel leaned forward in his chair. Judge Wellington, with all due respect, the only parties who have a legitimate interest in Mrs. Sullivan's future are Mrs. Sullivan herself and her daughter. No one else's opinion matters. Wellington's expression hardened slightly. Mr. Hayes, you're new to this community. You don't understand the delicate balance of relationships that keep a place like Copper Ridge functioning. Mrs. Sullivan's situation is complicated by factors beyond simple romantic attachment, such as the fact that she owes a substantial debt to a man who has been more than patient in waiting for repayment, such as the fact that precipitous action on her part might be seen as an attempt to evade her legal obligations, such as the fact that marrying a stranger might be viewed as an act of questionable judgment that calls into question her fitness as a mother. The last threat was delivered with the calm precision of a man who'd learned to use the law as a weapon. Daniel felt his anger rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. Are you threatening to take Emma away from her mother? I'm simply pointing out that the territorial government has an interest in ensuring that children are raised in stable, morally sound environments. A woman who would marry a complete stranger to escape her debts might not be considered the most reliable guardian. Daniel stood up slowly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Judge Wellington, I want to make sure I understand your position clearly. You're saying that you won't issue a marriage license to 2 consenting adults because doing so might interfere with Cyrus Hartwell's business interests? I'm saying that I need time to review the legal implications of such a union. Given the complexity of the situation, I believe a waiting period of, let's say, 30 days would be appropriate. 30 days, more than enough time for Hartwell to collect on his debt and force Grace into whatever alternative arrangements he had in mind. Daniel realized that the judge was completely in Hartwell's pocket, another piece of the web of corruption that the man had woven throughout Copper Ridge. I see, Daniel said quietly. Well, thank you for clarifying your position, Judge. I'll be sure to let Mrs. Sullivan know where you stand. Wellington had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Mr. Hayes, please understand that this is nothing personal. I'm simply trying to ensure that all legal requirements are properly met. Of course, Daniel replied. Just out of curiosity, what would happen if Mrs. Sullivan and I were to be married by someone else? Say a minister from another jurisdiction who happened to be passing through? The judge's eyes narrowed. Any marriage ceremony performed in this territory must be officially recognized by the territorial government to be legally valid. Without proper documentation, such a ceremony would be meaningless. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for the information, Judge. You've been very educational. As he left Wellington's office, Daniel's mind was already working on alternative solutions. If they couldn't get married legally in Copper Ridge, they'd have to find another way to protect Grace and Emma from Hartwell's predations. His next stop was the church, a modest wooden structure at the end of Main Street that served the spiritual needs of Copper Ridge's more religious residents. The pastor, Reverend Samuel Martinez, was a young man with kind eyes and the sort of idealistic demeanor that suggested he hadn't yet been completely worn down by the harsh realities of frontier life. Mr. Hayes, Martinez said, rising from the simple wooden desk where he'd been working on his Sunday sermon, how can I help you? I'd like to arrange a wedding ceremony for tomorrow, Daniel said. Between myself and Mrs. Grace Sullivan, Martinez looked surprised but pleased. How wonderful. I've been hoping that Mrs. Sullivan might find happiness again after her tragic loss. She's a remarkable woman who deserves better than the hardships she's faced. So you'll perform the ceremony? Well, of course, assuming all the legal requirements have been met. Do you have your marriage license? Daniel's heart sank. I'm working on that. Judge Wellington wants to review the situation before issuing the license. Martinez's expression grew troubled. I see. Well, I'm afraid I can't perform a ceremony without proper legal documentation. The territorial government is very strict about such matters. Even in emergency situations? What kind of emergency? Daniel chose his words carefully. Mrs. Sullivan is facing some pressure from certain members of the community. Pressure that marriage to me would help alleviate. Martinez's face darkened with understanding. You're referring to Mr. Hartwell's interest in her situation? You know about that. The young minister sighed heavily. Mr. Hayes, I may be a man of the cloth, but I'm not blind to what goes on in this community. I've seen how Mr. Hartwell operates, how he uses debt and desperation to control people. I've prayed many times for the strength to stand up to him. But he holds the mortgage on this church. He provides the funds that keep our doors open and our charitable works functioning. If I were to cross him directly, the entire congregation would suffer. Daniel nodded grimly. Another piece of Hartwell's web, another good person trapped by the man's systematic corruption of everything decent in Copper Ridge. Is there anything you can do to help? Daniel asked. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with his conscience. There might be a way, he said finally. It would be irregular, possibly risky, but there might be a way. I'm listening. There's a circuit preacher named Father O'Malley who travels through this region performing marriages and baptisms for communities that don't have permanent clergy. He's due to pass through Copper Ridge sometime in the next few days. If he were to perform your ceremony, would it be legally valid? In the eyes of God, certainly. In the eyes of the territorial government? Martinez shrugged. That would depend on whether anyone chose to challenge it. Father O'Malley has the authority to perform marriages throughout the territory. The fact that he might not have filed the proper paperwork immediately wouldn't necessarily invalidate the ceremony. It was a slim hope, but it was better than nothing. How do I find this Father O'Malley? He usually stays at the boarding house when he's in town. Mrs. Chen, who runs the place, would know if he's expected. Daniel thanked the minister and headed for his final stop of the morning, the boarding house run by Mrs. Li Chen, one of the few Chinese residents of Copper Ridge. The building was clean and well-maintained, though clearly suffering from the same financial pressures that affected everyone in town except Hartwell and his inner circle. Mrs. Chen was a small, dignified woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of quiet strength that Daniel had learned to respect. She listened carefully as he explained what he was looking for, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. Father O'Malley, she said finally. Yes, he comes through here every few months. Good man. Very kind to people others ignore. When is he expected? Today, Mrs. Chen said simply. He sent word that he would arrive this afternoon and stay the night before continuing on to Santa Fe. Daniel felt a surge of hope. Would you be willing to ask him about performing a marriage ceremony? Mrs. Chen studied his face carefully. This is for Mrs. Sullivan. To help her escape from Mr. Hartwell? Daniel was surprised by her directness. How did you know? Mrs. Sullivan brings me mending sometimes. We talk. I know her situation, know what that man wants from her. Mrs. Chen's expression hardened. Mr. Hartwell thinks because I am Chinese, because I am woman, I do not see what he does, but I see everything. Will you help? Father O'Malley is good man, but he is also careful man. He will want to know that this marriage is real choice, not just running from fear. It's both, Daniel said honestly. Grace is choosing to marry me partly for protection, but she's also choosing to trust me with her future and her daughter's future. That makes it real enough for me. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. I will speak to Father O'Malley when he arrives. If he agrees, the ceremony can be tonight. Tonight? Why wait? If Mr. Hartwell learns what you plan, he will try to stop it. Better to act quickly before he has time to interfere. Daniel felt a mixture of excitement and terror at the prospect of getting married in just a few hours. But Mrs. Chen was right. Delay would only give Hartwell more time to sabotage their plans. "Thank you," Daniel said sincerely. "You're taking a risk by helping us." Mrs. Chen smiled for the first time since their conversation began. "Mr. Hayes, I came to this country because I believed in the promise that here people could make their own choices about their lives. Mr. Hartwell thinks he can decide everyone's fate for them. Time someone showed him he is wrong." As Daniel walked back to Grace's cabin, his mind was racing with all the details that would need to be arranged in the next few hours. But for the first time since this adventure had begun, he felt genuinely optimistic about their chances of success. Hartwell might control the judge and intimidate the local minister, but he couldn't control everything. And sometimes, Daniel reflected, the best way to defeat a man who thought he owned everything was to remind him that some things, love, loyalty, and the human spirit, could never be bought or sold. The wedding ceremony had been simple but profound, conducted by Father O'Malley in Mrs. Chen's small parlor, with only the necessary witnesses present. As Daniel and Grace walked back to their cabin as husband and wife, the weight of what they'd accomplished began to settle on both their shoulders. "Well, Mrs. Hayes," Daniel said softly as they reached their front door, "how does it feel to be a married woman again?" Grace paused with her hand on the door latch, looking up at her new husband in the fading twilight. "It feels like the beginning of something I never dared to hope for," she said quietly. "It feels like we might actually have a chance." Emma bounced excitedly beside them. "Are we really a family now? A real, proper family?" "We are indeed," Daniel confirmed, lifting the little girl into his arms. "And real families take care of each other, no matter what storms might come." Inside the cabin, Grace busied herself with domestic tasks while Daniel arranged his few belongings in the corner that would serve as his space. It was an awkward transition, two adults who barely knew each other suddenly sharing the most intimate of spaces, bound together by necessity and hope rather than passion. "Daniel," Grace said hesitantly as she prepared tea for the three of them, "I want you to know that I understand the terms of our arrangement. You've given up everything to help us, and I don't expect, that is, I won't assume." "Grace," Daniel interrupted gently, "we're partners now, equal partners. This marriage will be whatever we make it, nothing more and nothing less. There's no rush, no pressure, no expectations beyond mutual respect and care for Emma." Grace's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you for understanding. I love Thomas deeply, and I'm not sure I'm ready to—" "You don't need to explain," Daniel said firmly. "We have all the time in the world to figure out what this becomes." Emma, who had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention of a child trying to understand adult complexities, piped up with her characteristic directness. "So you're married, but you're going to sleep in different places?" "For now," Grace said, her cheeks coloring slightly, "until we get to know each other better." "That makes sense," Emma said with the practical wisdom that had impressed Daniel from their first meeting. "Papa Thomas always said the best friendships start slow and grow strong. Maybe marriages can work the same way." Daniel and Grace exchanged a look of mutual surprise and admiration. This 9-year-old girl had just articulated something profound about the nature of their relationship, that it was built on choice and commitment rather than impulse, and that perhaps that made it more rather than less likely to endure. As evening deepened into night, they settled into the strange new rhythms of their merged household. Grace read to Emma from a well-worn book of fairy tales, while Daniel cleaned and oiled his weapons, a nightly ritual that had kept him alive through 18 years of frontier travel. "Mr. Hayes, Daniel," Emma said, looking up from her mother's lap, "will you tell us about some of the places you've been?" "I've never been anywhere except Copper Ridge." Daniel set aside his rifle and moved closer to the fire. "Well, let's see. I've been to Santa Fe, where the buildings are pink as sunset and the market smells like cinnamon and leather. I've seen the Great Canyon in Colorado, where the earth opens up like God took a bite out of the world. I've crossed deserts where the silence is so complete, you can hear your own heartbeat." Emma's eyes grew wide with wonder. "Will you take us to see those places someday?" "If your mother wants to travel, And if it's safe, then yes, Daniel said, glancing at Grace. A family should share adventures together. Grace smiled, the first truly relaxed expression Daniel had seen on her face since they'd met. I'd like that very much. I've always wondered what lay beyond the horizon. As they prepared for bed, the awkwardness returned. Daniel had spent the previous night on the floor, and it was clear that arrangement would continue for the foreseeable future. But somehow it felt different now, not like a stranger imposing on their hospitality, but like a family member making temporary accommodations. "Good night, Daniel," Grace said softly as she tucked Emma into bed. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Emma." "Good night, Papa Daniel," Emma said, the title slipping out naturally. Daniel felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. In the space of 4 days, he'd gone from complete solitude to being someone's husband and father. The transformation was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. As he settled onto his blankets on the floor, Daniel reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. Tomorrow would bring Hartwell's deadline, and with it the real test of their hastily constructed alliance. But tonight, listening to the quiet breathing of his new family, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The peace that comes from belonging somewhere, to someone. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying with it the promise of dawn and whatever challenges it might bring. But inside the cabin, 3 people who had found each other against all odds slept peacefully, bound together by choice and hope, and the growing certainty that sometimes the most unlikely families were also the strongest. The morning of reckoning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect weather that made the desert seem almost welcoming. But Daniel woke with the instinctive wariness of a man who'd learned to recognize the calm before the storm. Today was Sunday, Hartwell's deadline, and despite their marriage the night before, Daniel suspected their troubles were far from over. Grace was already awake, moving quietly around the small kitchen as she prepared what might be their last peaceful breakfast together. She looked different somehow, not just because she was now Mrs. Hayes instead of Mrs. Sullivan, but because there was a new confidence in her bearing, a sense of not being quite so alone in the world. "How did you sleep?" she asked softly as Daniel folded his blankets. "Better than I have in years," he replied truthfully. "And you?" "The same. There's something to be said for not facing the future alone." Emma stirred in her bed, then sat up with the bright alertness that was becoming familiar to Daniel. "Is today the day we find out if the bad man will leave us alone?" "Today is the day we start our new life as a family," Daniel said carefully. "Whatever Mr. Hartwell decides to do about that is up to him." As they shared breakfast, cornbread and coffee that tasted like hope, Daniel outlined his plans for the day. "I want to ride into town and let people know about our marriage. The more public knowledge there is of our situation, the harder it will be for Hartwell to cause trouble." "Is that wise?" Grace asked. "Won't it just make him angry?" "He's already angry," Daniel pointed out, "but anger and power aren't the same thing. If enough people know that you're under my protection now, it becomes much more difficult for him to act against you without consequences." Emma nodded seriously. "Like when I told everyone at school that Billy Thompson was a bully. Once everyone knew, he couldn't pick on the smaller kids anymore without getting in trouble." "Exactly like that," Daniel agreed, once again impressed by the girl's insight. After breakfast, Daniel saddled Storm and prepared to ride into town. It would be the first real test of their new arrangement. How would Copper Ridge react to the news that the widow Sullivan had married a stranger in a midnight ceremony? "Be careful," Grace said as he prepared to leave. "Hartwell has friends in town, people who depend on his goodwill for their livelihoods." "I will," Daniel promised. "But Grace, if anything happens to me, if Hartwell tries to claim that our marriage is invalid, you go straight to Mrs. Chen. She has the papers Father O'Malley signed, and she's promised to help you get word to the territorial authorities." Grace nodded, though Daniel could see the fear in her eyes. They were taking an enormous gamble, betting everything on a marriage certificate signed by a traveling preacher and witnessed by a Chinese woman whose word might not carry much weight in a territorial court. The ride into town was peaceful enough, but Daniel could feel eyes watching him from windows and doorways. Word of the wedding had clearly spread through Copper Ridge's efficient gossip network, and people were curious about this stranger who had married into their community under such unusual circumstances. His first stop was the general store, where he made a point of introducing himself to other customers as Daniel Hayes, Grace's new husband. The reactions were mixed. Some seemed genuinely pleased that Grace had found protection and companionship, while others appeared suspicious of his motives or concerned about Hartwell's reaction. "Congratulations on your marriage," said Mrs. Patterson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "Grace Sullivan is a fine woman who's had more than her share of troubles. I hope you'll be very happy together." "Thank you," Daniel replied. "I intend to do everything in my power to make sure she and Emma are safe and cared for." But not everyone was so welcoming. Jacob Miller, who Daniel learned owned a small ranch on the outskirts of town, pulled him aside with a worried expression. "Mr. Hayes, I don't know what your intentions are, but you should know that Cyrus Hartwell doesn't take kindly to interference in his business affairs. Grace Sullivan owes him a considerable sum of money, and he's been patient in collecting it." "The debt will be settled," Daniel said firmly. "Mrs. Hayes' obligations as a widow are now the responsibility of her husband to resolve." Miller's eyes widened slightly. "You're planning to pay off the debt? That's a considerable sum for a freight hauler." "I'm planning to take care of my family," Daniel replied, "whatever that requires." As word of his intentions spread through the store, Daniel could see the surprise and speculation in people's faces. A man willing to pay off his new wife's debts was either very wealthy or very foolish, and the consensus seemed to be that Daniel was probably the latter. His next stop was the church, where he hoped to speak with Reverend Martinez about making their marriage a matter of official church record. The young minister was in his office working on his Sunday sermon, and he looked up with a mixture of pleasure and concern when Daniel entered. "Mr. Hayes, I heard about your marriage to Mrs. Sullivan. Congratulations. Though I must admit, I was surprised to learn it had already taken place." "Father O'Malley was kind enough to perform the ceremony," Daniel explained. "I hope you don't take offense at our not waiting for you to return from your trip to Santa Fe." "Not at all," Martinez said quickly. "Father O'Malley is a respected member of the clergy with full authority to perform marriages throughout the territory. I'm just grateful that Grace has found happiness and protection." "I'd like to make sure the marriage is properly recorded in your church records," Daniel said, "and I'd appreciate it if you could mention our union during this morning's service. I want there to be no question in anyone's mind about the legitimacy of our relationship." Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "Of course, though I should warn you, Mr. Hartwell is a regular attendee at our services. He may not be pleased to hear the announcement." "Let him be displeased," Daniel said. "The truth is the truth, whether he likes it or not." As Daniel left the church, he encountered Sheriff Williams making his morning rounds. The lawman was a thin, nervous-looking individual who clearly spent more time worrying about politics than enforcing justice. "Mr. Hayes," Williams said, tipping his hat politely, "I understand congratulations are in order." "Thank you, Sheriff. I trust there are no legal complications arising from my marriage to Mrs. Hayes?" Williams shifted uncomfortably. "Well, now, that's a complicated question. There's been some discussion about Mrs. Sullivan's outstanding debts, and whether a sudden marriage might be seen as an attempt to evade legitimate financial obligations." "Sheriff," Daniel said carefully, "are you suggesting that two adults don't have the right to marry each other without seeking permission from their creditors?" No, of course not," Williams said quickly. "But Mr. Hartwell has considerable influence in this territory, and he's expressed some concerns about the timing of your marriage. He's asked me to investigate whether there might be grounds for fraud charges." Daniel felt his temper rising, but he kept his voice level. "Fraud charges? For marrying a woman I care about and accepting responsibility for her welfare?" "Like I said, it's complicated," Williams replied, clearly uncomfortable with the entire conversation. "I'm just advising you to be careful. Mr. Hartwell is not a man who accepts setbacks gracefully." As Daniel walked back toward his horse, he reflected on what he'd learned during his morning in town. Hartwell's influence was indeed extensive, reaching into the church, the law, and the business community. But Daniel had also sensed something else, an undercurrent of resentment toward Hartwell's heavy-handed methods. A sense that many people were tired of living under the thumb of a man who used fear and debt to control their lives. The question was whether that resentment could be turned into active support when the inevitable confrontation came. Daniel was mounting storm when he heard his name called from across the street. Turning, he saw Mrs. Chen approaching with a determined expression on her face. "Mr. Hayes," she said in her careful English, "I wanted to speak with you before you return home." "Of course, Mrs. Chen. What can I do for you?" "Word is spreading that Mr. Hartwell plans to challenge your marriage. He's telling people that it was arranged in haste to avoid legitimate debts, that it might not be legally valid." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And what do people think about his claims?" Mrs. Chen smiled grimly. "Some believe him because they are afraid not to. Others remember that Mr. Hartwell has used similar tactics before to get what he wants. But there are those of us who believe in justice, Mr. Hayes, who think it is time someone stood up to the spider in his web." "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that when the confrontation comes, and it will come, you may have more allies than you realize. People who have been waiting for someone with the courage to make a stand." Daniel felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. "Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your support, but I don't want anyone else to suffer because of my decisions. Hartwell is a dangerous man." "Mr. Hayes," Mrs. Chen said firmly, "sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing. My people have a saying, the tree that would grow tall must sometimes weather storms. Perhaps it is time for Copper Ridge to weather its storm and grow tall." As Daniel rode back toward the cabin, Mrs. Chen's words echoed in his mind. He'd come to this town as a solitary traveler with no connections and no responsibilities beyond his own survival. Now somehow, he'd become the focal point of what might be a larger struggle between those who believed in justice and those who relied on fear and intimidation. It wasn't a role he'd sought, but as he thought about Grace's grateful smile and Emma's trusting eyes, Daniel realized it was a role he was prepared to embrace. Because some things were worth fighting for, and some stands had to be made, regardless of the personal cost. The cabin came into view as storm crested the small rise, and Daniel could see Grace and Emma working in the garden behind the house. They looked peaceful, content, unaware that the storm clouds of confrontation were gathering on their horizon. But as Daniel drew closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were fresh hoof prints in the dirt around the cabin, several horses, moving at speed, arriving and departing within the last hour. Daniel spurred Storm into a gallop, his heart racing with fear and dread. Had Hartwell already made his move? Were Grace and Emma safe, or had his morning in town been a fatal mistake? As he thundered into the yard, Grace looked up from her weeding with a smile that quickly turned to concern when she saw his expression. "Daniel, what's wrong?" "Are you all right?" he demanded, dismounting before Storm had come to a complete stop. "Both of you?" "We're fine," Grace said, rising and brushing dirt from her dress. "But we did have visitors while you were gone." "Hartwell?" "No, not Hartwell himself, but 3 of his men came by about an hour ago. They said they were looking for you, said they had a message from their boss." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "What kind of message?" Emma appeared from behind a row of beans, her young face serious with the weight of adult concerns. "They said to tell you that Mr. Hartwell wants to meet with you this afternoon, at his store. Just you. Nobody else." "And if I don't come?" Grace's face paled. "They said there would be consequences, for all of us." Daniel felt the familiar cold anger that had gotten him through so many dangerous situations over the years. Hartwell was escalating the conflict, moving from financial pressure to direct intimidation. The message was clear: come alone and face whatever trap he'd prepared, or watch his new family suffer the consequences. "Daniel," Grace said quietly, "you don't have to do this. We could leave town, start over somewhere else." "No," Daniel said firmly. "Running would just mean facing this same situation in a different place with different predators. Besides, Emma was right when she asked me to marry you. Sometimes you have to make a stand, even when the odds are against you." Emma stepped closer to Daniel, her small hand slipping into his larger one. "Are you scared?" Daniel considered lying, then decided that this brave little girl deserved honesty. "Yes, I'm scared. But being scared and doing the right thing aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway." Emma nodded solemnly, processing this wisdom with the serious attention she gave to all important matters. "Then we'll be brave together." "No," Daniel said gently but firmly. I need to face Hartwell alone. But knowing that you and your mother are safe, knowing that I have a family worth fighting for, that gives me more strength than any army could." Grace moved to stand beside her husband and daughter, her hand coming to rest on Daniel's shoulder. "Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come back to us." "I promise," Daniel said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "I finally found something worth living for. I'm not going to give it up without one hell of a fight." The afternoon sun was blazing down mercilessly as Daniel rode storm toward the center of Copper Ridge, his mind focused and calm despite the danger he was riding into. He'd spent the past hour making preparations, cleaning his weapons, writing a letter to be delivered to the territorial authorities if he didn't return, and most importantly, saying what might be his final goodbyes to Grace and Emma. The town seemed unusually quiet as he made his way down Main Street. Most of the residents had apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor, choosing to observe the coming confrontation from behind closed doors and shuttered windows. But Daniel could feel their eyes watching him, could sense the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Hartwell's general store stood at the heart of Copper Ridge's business district, a substantial building that spoke of prosperity and permanence. But as Daniel approached, he could see that it was more than just a store. It was the center of a web of power and influence that extended throughout the territory. 4 men lounged on the covered porch, their casual postures failing to disguise the fact that they were armed and ready for trouble. These weren't local townspeople pressed into service. They were professional gunmen, the kind of men who sold their skills to whoever could pay their price. Daniel dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He wasn't here to start a fight, at least not if he could avoid it, but he was prepared to finish one if Hartwell forced the issue. "Mr. Hayes," called one of the gunmen, a tall man with cold eyes and a silver-handled revolver prominently displayed on his hip. "Mr. Hartwell is waiting for you inside. He said to come alone." "I'm alone," Daniel replied, though he kept his hand near his own weapon. "Lead the way." The interior of the store was dimmer than the bright street outside, and it took Daniel's eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, he found himself facing Cyrus Hartwell, across a space that had been carefully arranged for intimidation. The store owner sat behind a large wooden desk that had been positioned to catch the light from the windows, while the area where Daniel stood was left in relative shadow. "Mr. Hayes," Hartwell said without rising, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous, "thank you for accepting my invitation." "I don't recall having much choice in the matter," Daniel replied evenly. "Your men made it clear that declining wasn't an option." Hartwell's smile was like winter sunlight, bright but providing no warmth. "I apologize if my associates were overly emphatic in delivering my message, but I felt it was important that we have a private conversation about your recent change in marital status." "What about it?" "Well, it was rather sudden, don't you think? A man arrives in town, meets a woman, and marries her within a matter of days. Some might call that romantic. Others might use less flattering terms." Daniel remained standing, refusing to be intimidated by Hartwell's power games. What terms would those be? Fraud, for one. Conspiracy to evade legitimate debts, for another. There are laws against such things, Mr. Hayes, even in frontier territories. I'm not aware of any law that requires a man to seek permission from creditors before marrying the woman of his choice. Hartwell's smile widened, showing teeth that were white and sharp as a predator's. Perhaps not. But there are laws governing the transfer of debts through marriage, and there are certainly laws against conspiring to defraud legitimate businessmen. Daniel felt his patience beginning to fray, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Get to the point, Hartwell. What do you want?" "What I want," Hartwell said, rising from his chair with theatrical slowness, "is to resolve this situation in a manner that satisfies all parties involved." "And how do you propose to do that?" Hartwell walked around the desk, moving closer to Daniel, with the confident stride of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "It's quite simple, really. You annul this sham marriage, pay me the money that Mrs. Sullivan owes plus damages for the trouble you've caused, and leave Copper Ridge permanently. In return, I'll forget about filing charges with the territorial authorities. And if I refuse, then I'm afraid Mrs. Sullivan, or Mrs. Hayes if you prefer, will find herself facing some very serious legal difficulties. Fraud charges, charges of conspiracy, possibly even charges related to the welfare of her daughter. It would be tragic to see a child removed from her mother's care due to poor judgment on the part of her guardians. The threat was delivered with perfect politeness, but it hit Daniel like a physical blow. Hartwell wasn't just going after Grace. He was threatening to use the territorial court system to take Emma away from her mother. "You're a real piece of work, aren't you, Hartwell?" Daniel said, his voice low and dangerous. "Using a child as leverage to get what you want." "I'm a businessman, Mr. Hayes. I use whatever tools are necessary to protect my investments and maintain order in my community." "Your community?" Daniel's anger was building now, burning cold and focused in his chest. "These people aren't your property, Hartwell. They're human beings with the right to make their own choices about their lives." "Rights?" Hartwell laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Mr. Hayes, you're living in a fantasy if you think rights matter more than power out here. I own the bank, the store, half the businesses in town. I employ most of the men and hold mortgages on most of the properties. When I speak, people listen because they know what happens to those who don't. And what happens to those who don't?" Hartwell's mask of civility slipped slightly, revealing the ugly reality beneath. They lose their jobs, their homes, their place in the community. They find themselves isolated, desperate, with nowhere to turn for help. Eventually, they either submit to my authority or they leave. It's a simple but effective system. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Hartwell's words. "I see. And you think you can use that same system against my family?" "I don't think, Mr. Hayes. I know. You're one man with no connections, no resources, no understanding of how things work in this territory. I am the power here, and power always wins in the end." "Maybe," Daniel said quietly, "but you're forgetting something important." "What's that?" Daniel smiled, and there was something in his expression that made Hartwell take an involuntary step backward. "You're forgetting that sometimes power corrupts itself, and sometimes the people you've been oppressing get tired of living in fear." Before Hartwell could respond, the door of the store opened and a stream of people began filing in. Mrs. Chen entered first, her dignified bearing and determined expression making it clear that she was there by choice rather than compulsion. Behind her came Reverend Martinez, Dr. Morrison from the Territorial Medical Service, Sheriff Williams looking extremely uncomfortable, and a dozen other residents of Copper Ridge. "What is the meaning of this?" Hartwell demanded, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "This is a private meeting." "Not anymore," said Mrs. Chen calmly. "We've come to witness whatever agreements are made here today, and to make sure that all parties understand their rights under territorial law." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, a thin man with intelligent eyes and the kind of moral authority that came from years of public service. "Mr. Hartwell, I've been reviewing the territorial statutes regarding debt collection and marriage law. I think you'll find that your interpretation of the legal situation is somewhat creative." "Dr. Morrison," Hartwell said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "I don't recall asking for your legal opinion." "Nevertheless, you're going to get it," Morrison replied calmly. "The marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Hayes was performed by a duly authorized minister and properly witnessed. It is completely legal and binding under territorial law. Furthermore, any debts incurred by Mrs. Hayes prior to her marriage are now the responsibility of her husband to resolve as he sees fit." "And the charges of fraud?" "What fraud?" Morrison asked mildly. "Two adults chose to marry each other. A man chose to accept responsibility for his wife's prior obligations. I fail to see any criminal activity in either of those actions." Hartwell's face was growing redder by the minute. "This is preposterous. You people have no authority here." "Actually," Sheriff Williams said reluctantly, "Dr. Morrison is the territorial representative for legal affairs in this district. His interpretation of the law carries considerable weight with the territorial government. And I," said Reverend Martinez, "am prepared to testify that the marriage ceremony was conducted in full accordance with both civil and religious law. There are no grounds for questioning its validity." Hartwell looked around the room, his eyes moving from face to face, as he realized that his carefully constructed web of power and intimidation was unraveling before his eyes. "This is a conspiracy," he snarled. "You're all in this together." Yes, Mrs. Chen said simply. We are. We're together in believing that people have the right to live their lives without fear, without intimidation, without being treated as property by those who think money gives them the right to own other human beings. Daniel felt a surge of amazement and gratitude as he looked around the room. These people, many of whom he'd met for the first time that very morning, had chosen to stand up to Hartwell's tyranny. They'd risk their own security to protect a family they barely knew, simply because it was the right thing to do. Furthermore, Dr. Morrison continued, I've been investigating some of the business practices employed in this territory. I'm particularly interested in the use of debt manipulation and intimidation tactics to control the local population. The territorial government takes a very dim view of such activities. Hartwell's face went pale as the implications of this statement sank in. You can't prove anything. Perhaps not, Morrison admitted, but I can certainly conduct a thorough investigation, starting with a complete review of your financial records and business practices over the past 5 years. The room fell silent except for the sound of Hartwell's heavy breathing. Daniel could see the man's mind racing, trying to find a way out of the trap that had suddenly closed around him. What do you want? Hartwell asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. We want what we've always wanted, Daniel said, to be left alone to live our lives in peace. Grace's debt to you will be paid in full, and in return, you will leave our family alone permanently. And if I refuse, Dr. Morrison smiled coldly, then I'll recommend to the territorial governor that a full investigation be launched into the business practices employed in Copper Ridge. I suspect such an investigation would turn up all sorts of interesting irregularities. Hartwell was trapped, and everyone in the room knew it. He could accept Daniel's offer and cut his losses, or he could fight and risk losing everything he'd built through years of corruption and intimidation. How much? Hartwell asked through gritted teeth. $78, Daniel said firmly, the original amount of the loan, with no additional interest or fees. But the interest was never agreed to in writing, Dr. Morrison interrupted. I've reviewed Mrs. Hayes's copy of the loan agreement. There's no mention of compounding interest or additional fees. Hartwell's shoulders sagged in defeat. Very well, $78, and the debt is settled. Daniel reached into his coat and withdrew the leather pouch containing his life savings. He counted out the exact amount and placed it on Hartwell's desk, his movements deliberate and final. There, he said, the debt is paid. Now I want your word in front of all these witnesses that you will leave my family alone from this day forward. Hartwell stared at the money for a long moment, his face cycling through rage, humiliation, and calculation. Finally, he looked up at Daniel with eyes full of hatred. You have my word, he said. The debt is settled, and I will have no further business with your family. See that you remember that, Daniel said quietly, because if anything happens to my wife or daughter, anything at all, these good people will know exactly where to look for answers. As the crowd began to file out of the store, Mrs. Chen paused beside Daniel. You fought well, she said quietly. But remember, this is not over. Men like Hartwell do not forget humiliation. Then he'll have to live with it, Daniel replied, because I'm not going anywhere. The walk back to his horse felt like a victory parade, with people stopping to shake his hand and congratulate him on his courage. But Daniel knew Mrs. Chen was right. This was just the beginning of a longer struggle. Hartwell might have been defeated today, but men like him didn't give up easily. Still, as he mounted Storm and prepared to ride home to his family, Daniel felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with winning a fight. He'd stood up for what was right, and he discovered that he wasn't alone in believing that justice mattered more than power. The sun was beginning to set as Daniel crested the rise that brought his cabin into view. Grace and Emma were on the front porch, clearly watching for his return. When they saw him coming, Emma ran to meet him while Grace followed at a more dignified pace, though her relief was evident in every line of her body. Papa Daniel, Emma called out as he dismounted. Are you all right? Did the bad man hurt you? I'm fine, sweetheart, Daniel said, lifting her into his arms. And the bad man won't be bothering us anymore. Grace reached them, her eyes searching his face for signs of injury or distress. What happened? We heard that half the town went to Hartwell's store. Daniel smiled, feeling the tension of the day finally beginning to drain away. It seems we have more friends in Copper Ridge than we realized. People who were tired of living under Hartwell's thumb and willing to stand up for what's right. So it's really over? The debt is paid and Hartwell has given his word to leave us alone, Daniel confirmed. We're free, Grace. Really and truly free. Grace's eyes filled with tears as the weight of months of fear and desperation finally lifted from her shoulders. I can't believe it. After all this time, after everything we've been through. Believe it, Daniel said, wrapping his free arm around his wife while still holding Emma. We're a family now, and families stick together no matter what. As they stood together in the fading light, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, Daniel reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 days ago, he'd been a solitary freight hauler with no connections and no responsibilities beyond his own survival. Now he was a husband and father, a respected member of a community, a man with roots and relationships and a future worth fighting for. What happens now? Grace asked softly. Now, Daniel said, we build a life together. We raise Emma, we contribute to the community, we face whatever challenges come our way as a family. And someday, when we're old and gray, we'll tell our grandchildren about the day a brave little girl flagged down a stranger's wagon and changed everyone's life forever. Emma giggled at the thought. Will you really tell stories about me? I'll tell stories about all of us, Daniel promised, about courage and kindness and the way love can grow in the most unexpected places. As they walked toward their home together, Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude for the strange turns his life had taken. He'd thought he was looking for gold or land or opportunity, but what he'd found was infinitely more valuable. A place to belong, people to love, and a purpose that went beyond mere survival. The cabin looked different in the evening light, not like a temporary shelter, but like a real home where a real family lived and loved and built their dreams together. And as Daniel held his wife and daughter close, he realized that sometimes the most important journeys weren't about reaching a destination at all. Sometimes they were about finally having the courage to stop running and start living. The sound of children's laughter echoed across the Hayes homestead as the autumn sun cast long shadows over the expanded property that had once been just a simple cabin and small garden. Daniel Hayes stood on the porch of what was now a substantial 2-story house, watching his children play in the yard that Grace had transformed into a paradise of flowers, vegetables, and fruit trees. Emma, now 19 and beautiful with her mother's grace and intelligence, was teaching 8-year-old Michael how to properly harness the family's new buggy horse. The boy had Daniel's dark hair and stubborn streak, combined with Grace's green eyes and quick wit. Nearby, 6-year-old Sarah chased butterflies through the garden while 4-year-old Thomas, named for Grace's first husband, but belonging completely to Daniel's heart, built elaborate castles in the dirt with the focused concentration of a future engineer. They're getting so big, Grace said softly, joining her husband on the porch with baby Catherine sleeping peacefully in her arms. At 38, Grace Hayes had grown into a woman of remarkable beauty and strength, respected throughout the territory not just as Daniel's wife, but as a successful businesswoman, community leader, and mother to 5 children who were the pride of Copper Ridge. Too big, Daniel agreed, wrapping his arm around his wife's shoulders. Sometimes I look at Emma and I can't believe she's the same little girl who flagged down my wagon 10 years ago. She's not, Grace said with a smile. That little girl was desperate and afraid, willing to do anything to save her family. This young woman is confident and strong, with a bright future ahead of her. Emma had indeed grown into something remarkable. After completing her education at the territorial school, she'd chosen to stay in Copper Ridge and establish the territory's first lending library, funded by donations from grateful families throughout the region. She'd also begun writing down the stories of the area's early settlers, creating a historical record that future generations would treasure. Speaking of Emma's future, Grace said carefully, Dr. Morrison's son James has been calling rather frequently lately. Daniel groaned dramatically. Don't remind me. I'm not ready to think about Emma getting married and leaving home. She's not leaving home, Grace laughed. James has already asked if he can build a house on the south corner of our property. He wants to establish a medical practice here in Copper Ridge, and he wants Emma to be part of it. Daniel had to admit that James Morrison was a good young man, Educated, kind, hardworking, and completely devoted to Emma. But the thought of his eldest daughter getting married still made him feel old and protective in equal measure. Besides, Grace continued, Emma's not going anywhere. This is her home, we're her family, and she knows that. Just like you knew 10 years ago that sometimes the best thing you can do is stop running and put down roots. The transformation of Copper Ridge over the past decade had been remarkable. What had once been a struggling frontier town dominated by one man's greed and corruption was now a thriving community with a real school, a proper church, a territorial courthouse, and businesses that competed fairly for customers rather than relying on intimidation and debt manipulation. Cyrus Hartwell had left town 6 months after his confrontation with Daniel, selling his remaining interests to honest businessmen and disappearing into the vast expanses of the American West. Some said he'd gone to California, others claimed he'd headed back east to try his schemes in a new location. Daniel didn't much care where the man had gone, as long as he stayed gone. The Hayes family had prospered beyond Daniel's wildest dreams. His freight business had grown into one of the largest shipping operations in the territory, connecting dozens of communities and providing reliable transportation for both goods and people. Grace's seamstress business had evolved into a dress shop that served customers from across 3 territories, and her designs were beginning to appear in fashion magazines back east. But more than the financial success, Daniel treasured the life they'd built together. The marriage that had begun as a desperate arrangement between strangers had grown into a deep, abiding love that strengthened with each passing year. They'd faced droughts and floods, economic hardships and personal losses, the challenges of raising 5 children and building a business empire, and through it all, they'd remained partners in the truest sense of the word. Daniel, Grace said suddenly, do you ever regret it? Giving up your plans for California, settling down with a ready-made family, taking on responsibilities you never asked for? It was a question she asked periodically, usually when she was feeling particularly reflective about the path their lives had taken, and Daniel's answer was always the same. Never, he said firmly, pulling her closer and pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I spent 20 years wandering around looking for something I couldn't name, chasing destinations that always seemed to move just out of reach. I thought I was looking for gold or land or opportunity, but what I was really looking for was home. And did you find it? Daniel looked out over their property, the house they'd built together, the children they were raising, the community they'd helped create, and felt the same sense of wonder and gratitude that had sustained him through a decade of challenges and triumphs. I found something better, he said. I found out that home isn't a place you travel to. It's something you build with people who choose to love you every single day. Grace smiled and leaned against his shoulder, baby Catherine stirring slightly in her sleep. Emma says she's going to write our story down someday, turn it into a book for her children and grandchildren to read. What kind of story would it be? A love story, I suppose, but not the usual kind. Not the kind that starts with lightning and passion and dramatic declarations. The kind that starts with 2 broken people choosing to build something beautiful together, one day at a time. From the yard came the sound of Michael whooping with joy as he successfully guided the buggy horse through a series of turns that Emma had set up with wooden barrels. Sarah clapped enthusiastically while Thomas abandoned his dirt castles to run alongside the buggy, his short legs pumping as he tried to keep up with the horse. I should probably go help before someone gets hurt, Daniel said, but he made no move to leave Grace's side. In a minute, Grace replied. Let me just appreciate this moment for a little while longer. Because that, Daniel had learned, was the secret to building a happy life, not just planning for the future or remembering the past, but paying attention to the present moment and recognizing it as the gift it truly was. A loving wife in his arms, healthy children playing in the yard they'd created together, a community that accepted him as one of their own, and the promise of grandchildren to love and spoil in the years to come. It wasn't the life he'd planned when he'd first driven his freight wagon into Copper Ridge 10 years ago, but it was infinitely better than anything he could have imagined. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of a train whistle. The new railroad line that connected Copper Ridge to the wider world had been completed just last year, bringing prosperity and progress to the entire region. But Daniel barely heard it, focused as he was on the simple miracle of his family's happiness. "You know what I think?" Grace said softly, her voice filled with contentment. "What's that?" "I think Emma was right to stop your wagon that day. I think she saw something in you that you didn't even see in yourself. The capacity for love, for commitment, for building something lasting and beautiful." "What did she see?" Grace turned in his arms so she could look directly into his eyes. She saw a man who was tired of running, who was ready to fight for something that mattered, who had room in his heart for a family that needed him as much as he needed them. Daniel thought about that 9-year-old girl who had stepped boldly into the street and asked a stranger to marry her mother. Emma Hayes Morrison, for she'd taken her stepfather's name legally when she turned 18, was now a confident young woman engaged to a good man, with a bright future ahead of her. But Daniel would never forget the courage it had taken for a desperate child to believe that a stranger might be the answer to her family's prayers. "I'm grateful every day that she was brave enough to ask," Daniel said, "and that I was smart enough to say yes." "Are you really?" Even knowing everything that came after, the confrontations with Hartwell, the financial struggles, the sleepless nights with sick babies, the worry and responsibility and constant effort required to build a life together? Daniel considered the question seriously. The past 10 years hadn't been easy. Building a marriage from scratch, raising children, establishing businesses, dealing with droughts and economic downturns, and all the countless challenges that faced frontier families. It had required every ounce of strength and determination he possessed. But as he looked at Grace's face, radiant with love and contentment, as he listened to his children's laughter floating across the evening air, as he contemplated the life they'd built together from nothing but hope and hard work, Daniel felt only gratitude for the path his life had taken. "Especially knowing all that," he said firmly, "the struggles made us stronger. The challenges brought us closer together. The responsibility gave me purpose I never knew I was missing. I wouldn't change a single day of it." Grace kissed him softly, a kiss that tasted of shared memories and future dreams. "I love you, Daniel Hayes." "I love you too, Grace Hayes. More than I thought possible when this all began." From the yard came Emma's voice calling them to come see Michael's latest triumph with the buggy horse. Soon they would go inside for dinner. The whole family gathered around the table Grace had insisted on buying when Thomas was born, big enough for all of them, with room to grow as their family expanded. After dinner, Daniel would read to the younger children while Emma and Grace worked on wedding plans. Later, when the children were asleep, he and Grace would sit on their porch swing and talk about their plans for expanding the freight business, about Emma's upcoming wedding, about the baby Catherine was becoming, and the people all their children might become. But for now they stood together in the golden light of evening, holding each other close and marveling at the mysterious ways life had of surprising you with exactly what you needed, exactly when you needed it most. 10 years ago, Emma Sullivan had been a desperate little girl, willing to do anything to save her family. Grace had been a widow facing impossible choices. Daniel had been a lonely man running from a past that haunted him and toward a future that seemed always just out of reach. Now they were the Hayes family, prosperous, respected, loved, and loving. They were proof that sometimes the most beautiful love stories weren't about finding your perfect match, but about choosing to build something perfect together, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one act of love at a time. And sometimes Daniel reflected as he watched his children play in the gathering dusk. The most important journey you could take was the one that led you home to people who chose to love you, not despite your flaws, but because of the way those flaws fit perfectly with their own, creating something stronger and more beautiful than either of you could have been alone. The story that had begun with a child's desperate plea had become something extraordinary, a testament to the power of love to transform lives, the courage it takes to trust a stranger with your heart, and the truth that sometimes the most precious destinations are the ones that find you, rather than the ones you spend your life searching for. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the Hayes family gathered together on their porch, ready for whatever adventures tomorrow might bring. Because they had learned the most important lesson of all, that home wasn't a place you found. It was something you built together with the people who mattered most. And in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, that made all the difference between merely surviving and truly living. Sometimes the most life-changing moment comes from the most unexpected source. When 9-year-old Emma Sullivan stepped into that dusty street and asked a stranger to marry her mother, she set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just 3 lives but an entire community. This story reminds us that courage comes in all sizes, that love grows in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help when you need it most. Daniel Hayes thought he was just helping a desperate family escape debt, but he found something infinitely more valuable: a home, a purpose, and a love that grew stronger with each passing day. Have you ever taken a leap of faith that completely changed your life? Have you ever been that person who said yes when someone desperately needed help? Share your stories in the comments below. We read every single one, and your experiences inspire the tales we tell. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more heartwarming stories from the frontier, where courage, compassion, and love built the foundation of the American West. Because out here, there are still so many truths left to tell, each one carved from hope, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that make us human. The next time you see someone who needs help, remember Emma Sullivan's courage and Daniel Hayes' generosity. Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything. Not just for the person you help, but for yourself and everyone whose lives you touch along the way.